Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures, your future. And I wondered if you've ever thought, how am I going financially? It's a question I know many Australians ask themselves, but I guess very few actually say it out loud. So whether you're just starting out deep into your wealth building years or nearing a requirement, I think it's natural to wonder, how do I stack up compared to others? So that's what we're going to discuss today. So at the end of today's show, and it's not a judge of where you are or how successful you are, but you're going to understand where you fit in. So Simon, today I'd like to have a look at this fascinating and maybe it's a bit uncomfortable world of generational wealth.
Yeah, it is always a hot topic, and it's a difficult topic because once you compare yourself, there is always the risk of losing out, particularly since people tend to not really know where they stand. And so I always think about this as the pyramid phenomenon. When you ask people about their social class, almost everyone claims to be middle class. And essentially they're answering in their head the question, do I know people that are richer, or do I know of people that are richer? Yes, yes, yes. Do I know of people that are poorer? Yes, yes, yes. And they go, but clearly I'm in the middle. So therefore I'm the middle class. And that is, depending on who you talk to, spectacularly wrong.
Well, very much so. And we've spoken about that before. And you've written an amazing article, and we've discussed it about the cereal aisle and how in Australia, I think most of us feel that there's some rich people and some poor people and a significant middle class, but it's not really that way anymore, is it?
No, it tends to be the exact opposite. Instead of this bell curve that you just described, we now have this U-shape wealth distribution where you have low-income earners, you have high-income earners, and we continue to shrink the number of middle-income earners or wealth holders, so to speak, depending on how you want to phrase the topic. And that has all those real implications of where do we make policy for? Because the idea that one policy essentially helps the middle class and that helps most people, and that's not really the case anymore. So by now, either a policy favors the rich or it favors the poor, because the middle class loses social importance, so to speak.
I guess that's why the politicians are having so much trouble. Simon, before we get into the numbers, let's start with, why do you think people are so fascinated and maybe even a little bit anxious about how their wealth compares to others?
You need to know your standard. It's like, what am I worth? How much money should I earn? It's like, that usually depends on, in a company, people know it's like, well, I'm better, I'm more experienced than that fella, so I should earn more. Like, to be honest, like, she is much more experienced ahead of me, so I can't really claim her wage. So it must be somewhere there. This is kind of how we navigate where we should be and what we should have. And when we then look at the intergenerational differences in wealth, we also compare ourselves then to past versions of our parents, usually our parents' generation, because that's who we are most familiar with, since we grew up in the households of our parents. And therefore, these are the wealth markers, the ownership markers that we actually care about.
Well, the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Tax Office gives us lots of wealth-related data, and Australians are amongst the wealthiest people in the world. Well, at least on paper. Look, maybe I should give a disclaimer. To me, true wealth isn't about how much money you've got or how much property you've got. To be truly wealthy, you need money plus somebody to love and somebody to love you. Money plus the ability to keep growing. Money plus your health. There's no use having money and being sick in hospital. Money plus relationships, the spirituality, the ability to have vacations and contribute to the community. But Simon, I'd like to actually break down into some numbers. The average Australian household now boasts net worth of just over $1 million. And this includes their property, superannuation, shares, minus their debts or loans. Australians are doing very, very well, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. But again, that's an average, and all the figures we're going to talk about now are averages. But I want to dig deeper and look at how each generation compares, Simon. So let's start with the baby boomers. On average, they're worth more, but they've been around longer. They've had the ability to do that. So let me run some quick figures for our listeners and viewers. The average baby boomer household has 1.3 million in property assets, 641,000 in superannuation or business assets. This is according to the ABS, 206,000 in shares, 140,000 in cash savings. And that gives them, baby boomers, a net wealth of $2.3 million with only 82,000 in debt. That's amazing, but they've had many decades to build that up, Simon.
Exactly. And so we would, of course, expect that older generations, assuming there wasn't a horrible war or anything that massively destroyed the wealth base, that you manage to accrue wealth. And of course, the more money you have, the easier it is to grow that pile because you have more money to invest into other assets. They continue to go up in price. And so you just essentially play the waiting game by living longer and accruing that wealth. Yes, of course, hard work goes into that equation as well and so forth. But ultimately, the older you are, the richer you should be, statistically speaking.
Well, interestingly, about half Australia's housing wealth is held by baby boomers. But in previous shows, we've discussed about the massive intergenerational wealth transfer coming in the decades ahead. Could be three, could even be up to $6 trillion worth of baby boomer assets being passed on. If you're new to this show, or if you haven't listened to our past podcasts, wherever you're listening to this, first of all, subscribe to the show. But secondly, go back and have a look at the intergenerational wealth transfer discussion, because that's going to shape the future of many younger generations going ahead, Simon.
Yes, the wealth transfer is, of course, when in relatively short 1.5 decades, we'll shift the wealth from boomers now to their kids, mostly the millennials. And so these numbers will then change a bit, at least on these average numbers, because again, many millennials will not have parents that throw inheritances at them at all. And these families, these millennials will then have a relative disadvantage compared to those millennials that in their late 50s, early 60s do inherit quite a bit of the property wealth and asset wealth of the baby boomers.
Well, as we go through the various generational groups, after the baby boomers came Gen Xers. They were born between 1965 and 1980. And we've discussed those in generational podcasts before. There's a great series that we did at the beginning of this year on the various generation groups. And Simon, you called them the sandwich generation because they were juggling mortgages, kids, and supporting aging parents.
Exactly. So they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. This is the Gen X cohort right now that has financial costs associated with their kids because they are not out of the house yet, or maybe they're at uni, but you still pay for them for a bit. They soon or maybe already have parents, aging parents that they either care for or support them financially. They are most likely to have overextended their mortgage during the low interest rate phase of the pandemic. They're tough. Plus, of course, Gen X is stuck between the big millennial and boomer generations. So, which is why their forgotten generational narrative comes from. They often feel underlooked. And if you talk to the banks right now, this is the cohort that the banks are most worried about. So when you talk about forfeiting of mortgages, not being able to pay, that's Gen X
They're
because
in their prime earning years, though, Simon, aren't they?
exactly. They earn a lot of money. They're in their late 40s, early 50s. You have nice and high incomes, but property and everything is still so expensive that these Gen Xers, they rely on two household incomes. They did really, or many of them did extend their borrowing capacity to the absolute max during the pandemic years. And so now that you have elevated interest rates, that you now have potentially some of their jobs at risk. If you think about these are middle management type jobs, and you don't need to be too creative in your outlook to say maybe some of those middle management jobs can be automated, AI'd away so that they lose a job. They have to take a lower paying job or something like this. The house of cards with Gen X that could fall for some of the households, not for all of them at all, but this is a couple of risky years ahead. That said, in about a decade, on a single Tuesday, if you will, everything for Gen X changes because the kids move out of the house. They're no financial burden anymore. The mortgage is finally paid off and their parents die all on the same day. So that means that all of the financial cost pressures that Gen X felt from one day to the next are gone. So this will
Well, they've
be
just got to
an
get there.
insane spending spree that we see out of Gen X in about 10 years.
Well, at the moment, though, the statistics would suggest they've got a $1.3 million worth of property assets. They've got about 586,000 in their superannuation. They own shares worth 256,000. They've got some cash, 176. That puts their net wealth at $1.88 million because they've got close to 450,000 in debt. So as you say, they're earning a lot. Do you think they're going to catch up with the baby boomers, or will their financial trajectory look different?
Probably not catch up, I would say. But ultimately, they are in relatively little competition. That's an advantage that they have, that there aren't that many Gen Xers around for those top leadership jobs. So that means if your career has a level of seniority built to it as a Gen Xer, you are now more likely to get the top payments because there are fewer of them around. When boomers reached the top job phase of the life cycle, there were heaps of them around. So boomers needed to be a bit more elbows out type of fierce competition for them. Gen X could afford to be much more collegial in their behavior there. And so, I mean, I think there is a certain kind of lack of aggression there that ultimately might translate into just earning a bit less money. But of course, there's also the generational narrative that Gen X always figured there must be a new way of work out there. So they decided that work-life balance is absolutely crucial. Is that time with the kids is much more important than increasing the household finances. And so they had a different approach to life towards wealth creation or wealth accumulation than the boomers had before, and it is playing out in those numbers. A big chunk of the wealth from Gen X is, of course, a relatively higher super compared to what the boomers would have had at the same age group, simply because super wasn't really a thing for the early decades of boomers' careers. It was only introduced in the 90s. And so Gen X will have paid superannuation for their career throughout their whole career. So they have this really, when Gen X retires, this is the first time that we really see superannuation play out in its full life cycle.
Sure. Having said that, it probably won't be enough to sustain them, so they're going to have to invest in the meantime as well. Now, I want to talk about the millennials, those born between 1981 and 96. I know a lot of our audience is that age group. Many are in their 30s, early 40s, and they're juggling childcare costs, career development, home ownership. And when you look at their figures, according to putting together these stats from Australian Bureau of Statistics, they are nowhere near as wealthy as older generations. Understandably, their property assets average out, and all these are averages, of course, at $750,000. They've got less in their super, $260,000. They own $51,000 worth of shares. Average millennials got $104,000 worth of cash, and that gives them a net wealth of something like $757,000 because they've got debts against that as well. Millennials make up about 15% of households, but Simon, they only hold 5% of the national wealth.
Yeah, and I would say millennials are probably the generation that feels most heavily left out at the moment because they are comparing themselves to their parents, who were the boomers who managed to accrue much more property assets because assets were much cheaper then in relationship to
Yes.
income than they are today. And so they kind of envy the older generations for that. That creates a bit of intergenerational conflict there. And you just feel like these things haven't worked for me. Back in the day when I went to university as a baby boomer, this was a guarantee for a reasonably high income. And by now, we're sending half of our year 12s to university. So it's hardly the great standout gift, financially speaking, that it once was. We now even charge you quite a bit of money to go to uni, which is why you start your career with ever higher debts, which is not really desirable at all. So you go, what do we do here? And millennials, they work hard to enter the property market, and they need to do this at scale now because they're making babies. They have 12 years worth of baby making left in the tank as a generation. That means you need those assets now. And baby boomers aren't dying out of the assets for another 10 years or so. So this doesn't really overlap here. They aren't helping each other there, so to speak. Yeah, so it's definitely a generation that is very, very unhappy with the status quo. I think there must be a better way. And there are plenty of millennials out there that feel, shouldn't I be better off?
Do you think they're rethinking what wealth means? I think more of them, if they can't get into property, are now thinking about shares or ETFs or even crypto as a way of financial security.
Yeah, so with crypto, of course, I think part of this is the idea that you go, there must be, this is let's chuck it all out. Let's find something new. And there are, of course, those really, really crypto true believers who tell you about the technical side of crypto, the idea of how important it is to decentralize finance and so far and so forth. But I think most of the millennials that hold a couple of thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars in crypto, they're really what I call squiggly line investors. They essentially follow this hope that you invest a couple of peanuts into a asset and then it, without you doing anything, goes up 1,000 times. And there are, of course, those people who did this, who bought Bitcoins, which are now at 120,000 US
Yes.
dollars. They bought them at a couple of pennies and they're now gazillionaires. good on him. But ultimately, this is just a highly speculative asset that went up. And so you feel like this is the shortcut. It's like playing the lottery. Where you go, I pay a couple of pennies for the lottery ticket and somehow I get $20 million in return for my efforts.
Sounds like a nice way of doing things. And I guess people are thinking it's the only way I'm going to get out of the rat race. What I would actually tell them is that they have got something the baby boomers and Gen Xers haven't. It's actually a long runway. And baby boomers started with nothing, as did the Gen Xers. And so therefore, most of them had to build it up slowly, step by step. So there is still chance for the millennials, but also the younger generation behind them, Gen Zs, because they're really just getting started. They're people born between 97 and 2012. They're just entering their workforce. I mean, the financial picture, according to, I'm actually going to leave a link in the show notes to an article I wrote, and I used information from KPMG about where different generations' wealth stands at the moment. And it actually showed that the net wealth of Gen Zs was $96,000, but they had debts of $49,000 as well. They're just starting off in the world, aren't they?
Absolutely. So you wouldn't expect someone who is in their early 20s, maybe late 20s, to have all
I
that
was
money.
surprised how much wealth they actually had if that was the average.
Yeah, if you think about where the wealth comes from, this is a bit of superannuation because many people now work in their teenage years, 10% here, 10% there. That adds up over a decade of doing this. So you have a lot of money stored in your superannuation, much higher than previous generations would have. But of course, the debt, which is mostly linked to student, to educational debt rather than housing debt, it still remains to be seen how they fare because the getting onto the property ladder will be harder for them.
Yes.
And so you go, well, how do I start accruing wealth? And of course, do we then push alternative asset classes? Will cryptocurrency be the magical solution? I'm hyper critical of this, but I'm also not an expert. I'm happy for anyone to make money in crypto, go for it. But I believe the general truism that people taught me, financial folks, about crypto is that invest as much money into crypto as you're happy to lose.
Well, I did that. So while my sons actually hung in longer and have done okay, but they accepted it was purely speculative. I guess if you've been listening to this or watching this and you don't currently subscribe to our podcast, please stop for a second, click on the follow or subscribe button, depending upon what your app says, so that once a week you get information from Simon and me. And if you're ahead of the averages, well done. And if you're not at where the averages are, look, don't worry. I think there's a couple of lessons we can take away from this, Simon. First of all, averages don't show the full picture. It is an average. So there's lots of people who earn more, others less. And I think another big lesson, and we've said it a couple of times, is wealth builds over decades. Time in the market is important. Of course, building wealth and preserving it is a totally different discussion. So you need a different mindset on preserving wealth because, Simon, as soon as people get more pay, they seem to spend it, don't they?
That's the whole argument of the lifestyle inflation. This is, of course, I had enough, if you will, spiritual training and narratives there where I'd go. The ultimate goal is to free yourself from desires. This is where the real freedom comes from. So very Buddhist teaching there, if you will, even though every religion has this kind of teaching in it, is that there is the rat race, what for? So if you can keep your desires down, your happiness goes up. We know all of this. There's plenty of research out there, but this is, of course, where the data guy comes in. Looking and comparing yourself to those narratives is helpful to also feel something like gratitude, because it is very, very easy to think that you are actually doing rather poorly just because you know of people that are richer. And on social media and everything, we constantly see people who are richer
Of
and
course.
better off. And so our picture gets screwed up there. And so if you go like, you're actually ahead of the game a bit, even if it's just a bit, you go like, I'm doing all right. And so you might just be able to, pat yourself on the back there for a little bit and go, this is not all as bad as it might feel sometimes.
Well, on social media, you see people's highlight reels, not all the bits that are on the cutting room floor, if you take the old analogy of when they put videos together. By the way, Simon, I think one of the other messages from this is that property remains the cornerstone of wealth for every generation in Australia compared to other countries. So as we went through each of those, Australian Bureau of Statistics keeps showing each month that how much wealth there is in the residential real estate market. Currently, it's valued at about $11.4 trillion. And yes, there's debt against it, but it's only about $2.4 trillion. So the average Australian's wealthy because of their homes and their superannuation. And then there's about 2.2 million Australians who've actually taken on the financial risk of running a small business of providing rental accommodation because they're wanting to enhance their financial future and give them some more choices. So property is important, but so is debt management. Leverage is important to get your debt, your growth, your asset growth, but you've also got to have the right finance structure and strategy. And that's what we do at Metropole by building a strategic plan for our clients, which includes a finance strategy, not just a property strategy. Now, Simon, you help your clients at the demographic group by understanding what's ahead for their businesses, their organizations in the future, looking at demographics. Explain maybe a bit about how you do that.
Yeah, so we used data to do this. We tell people what their runway for their business, for their industry, for maybe their local government area, if you're a government, what this looks like, and then we see certain kind of ups and lows. We see certain emerging pain points. We talked about the retirement cliff before. We know what kind of share of your workforce will fall away, so that has an idea about where do you get your workers from. So you must think about your staffing pipeline from there, and. So there's endless narratives where the demographic data helps you just to understand either the status quo better, so that you right now have a better product offering, or it allows you to look in the future so that you can actually make smart, informed, data-driven strategic positions rather than just relying on your gut feeling. Your gut might be healthy and might be a great gut, but ultimately adding a bit of data into the diet usually helps a lot.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes to the demographics group where they can find out more about your services. To finish off, Simon, what advice would you give to listeners or viewers who feel they've been left behind when they compare themselves to these averages we've spoken about?
Don't be discouraged is the main idea. You already set the runway metaphor here. You have a long time to go, and it is the idea of being deliberate and strategic in your financial investments, in your earning strategy, in your spending, all these things. Essentially, all self-help books break down to that. Be deliberate and have a plan and work hard. And these things, this is the best stuff that you have in your control. There's plenty of stuff that is completely outside of your control, and you can either become a fantastic activist or politician trying to solve these kind of systemic issues, or you do your bit and hope for the best on the strategic front.
Well, for viewers and listeners, if you're ahead of average, well done. But remember, preserving wealth is just as important as creating it. But if you're behind, don't worry, don't panic. As Simon said, the best time to start was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And at Metropole, we help our clients of all generations build, protect and pass on their wealth safely and strategically. So if you'd like to understand how we can help you, why not book a complimentary Wealth Discovery chat? You'll find a link in the show notes. So thanks for joining us for this week's Demographic Decoded show. If you don't currently subscribe, please click the subscribe or follow button, and please do Simon and me a favor as our way of being able to pass this message on to more people. Just tell one person about the Demographics Decoded or show, or in every podcast app, there's a little button that you can click to actually forward it to somebody else. If you found this interesting, pass it on to somebody else, and you can show off how well you're doing financially. Simon, look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Fantastic. I'll see you next week.